Welcome back to the Starcade Collective. My name is Parker and I'll be your host for today. Today I'll be talking about a much requested topic, the flower game, as it's known within the Unveiling lore book. This video is a bit different from the other lore videos as I'll be reading 3 entries from the Unveiling lore book and then giving my thoughts on them, as well as some speculation about what it's about and who the people in the story are. For a small bit of context, this story features 2 characters, the Gardener and the Winnower. In a previous entry of the Unveiling, it is explained that a long time ago, the Gardener and the Winnower lived together in the garden. Though it's mentioned that time doesn't exist, they have no real physical bodies, and that the garden was a field of possibility that prefigures existence itself. Every morning, the gardener would sow seeds in the garden, and every evening, the winnower would reap the day's crop and separate what flourished from what had failed. In between the morning and the evening, the gardener and the winnower would play a game. One more thing, this story, as well as the other lore entries in the Unveiling book, is told to us by the darkness. And the story about the flower game itself is one big metaphor, so what you hear me read out today should be taken with a big pinch of salt. Now that that's all out of the way, let's get on with the reading. These are the rules of a game. Let it be played upon an infinite 2-dimensional grid of flowers. Rule 1. A living flower with less than 2 living neighbors is cut off. It dies. Rule 2. A living flower with 2 or 3 living neighbors is connected. It lives. Rule 3. A living flower with more than 3 living neighbors is starved and overcrowded. It dies. Rule 4. A dead flower with exactly 3 living neighbors is reborn. It springs back to life. The only play permitted in the game is the arrangement of the initial flowers. This game fascinates kings. This game occupies the very emperors of thought. Though it only has 4 rules and the board is a flat, featureless grid, in it you will find changeless blocks, stoic as iron, and beacons and whirling pulsars, as well as gliders that soar out to infinity, and patterns that lay eggs and spawn other patterns, and living cells that replicate themselves wholly. In it, you may construct a universal computer with the power to simulate, very slowly, and any other computer imaginable, and thus simulate whole realities, including nested copies of the flower game itself. And the game is undecidable. No one can predict exactly how the game will play out except by playing it. And yet this game is nothing compared to the game played by the gardener and the winnower. It resembles that game as a seed does a flower. No, as a seed resembles the star that fed the flower and all the life that made it. In their game, the gardener and the winnower discovered shapes of possibility. They foresaw bodies and civilizations, minds and cognitions, qualia and suffering. They learned the rules that governed which patterns would flourish in the game and which would dwindle. They learned those rules because they were those rules. And in time, the gardener became vexed. "It always ends the same," the gardener complained. "This one stupid pattern." "Aren't they beautiful?" I asked, as the flowers opened and closed in patterns beyond the scope of entire universes to encode, all devouring and perhaps everlasting. Not even we could know whether a pattern in the flowers would cycle forever, or someday halt. "They're as dull as carbon monoxide poisoning," the gardener groused, although carbon monoxide did not yet exist, and neither did anything that could be poisoned. The gardener kneeled to flick a patch of sod with their trowel. It struck an open flower, causing it to shut. Although I was the closer of flowers, and that was my sole purpose, I felt no fear or jealousy. We had our assigned dominions, and always would. "They're majestic," I said. "They have no purpose except to subsume all other purposes. There is nothing at the center of them, except the will to go on existing, to alter the game to suit their existence. They spare not one sliver of their totality for any other work. They are the end." The pattern corrected the errant flower effortlessly. The great flow went on unchanged. The gardener got up and brushed their knees. Every game we play, this one stupid pattern consumes all the others, wipes out every interesting development. A stupid, boring exploit that cuts off entire possibility spaces from ever arising. There's so much that we'll never get to see because of this pest. They chewed at their cracked lip, which existed only because this is an allegory. I'm going to do something about it, they said. We need a new rule. I looked up in shock. I said, What? What do you mean? A special new rule, something to... The gardener threw up their hands in exasperation. I don't know. To reward those who make space for new complexity. A power that helps those who make strength from heterodoxy and who steer the game away from gridlock. Something to ensure there's always someone building something new. It'll have to be separate from the rest of the rules, running in parallel, so it can't be compromised, and we'll have to be very careful so it doesn't disrupt the whole game. All you will do, I said, with the rising panic fury, is delay the dominant pattern that will overrun the others. It is inevitable. One final shape. No, it'll be different. Everything will be different, everywhere you look. Everything will be the same. Your new rule will only make great false cysts of horror, full of things that should not exist, that cannot withstand existence, that will suffer and scream as their rich blisters fill with effluent and rot around them. And when they pop, they will blight the whole garden. Whatever exists because it must exist, and because it permits no other way of existence, has the absolute claim to existence. That is the only law. No, the gardener said. I am the growth and preservation of complexity. I will make myself into a law in the game. And thus we too became parts of the game, and the laws of the game became gnomic and open to change by our influence. And I had only one purpose and one principle in the game, and I could do nothing but continue to enact that purpose, because it was all that I was and ever would be. I looked at the gardener. I looked at my hands. I discovered the first knife. So there's a lot to unpack here, but that's also why this is a longer style video as opposed to the 1 minute length videos that we've done before. I feel like it's impossible to talk about this topic in about a minute, and frankly, I don't feel like anyone could do this amazing story justice in that small amount of time. I also specifically chose to read these 3 lore entries from the Unveiling lore book, since this trio of entries all talk about the Flower game, and reading just the Flower game entry would feel a bit too shallow. Now, the game itself is quite interesting. Even though it's mentioned as a game, something to pass the time or entertain, it is pretty much everything but that. Most people, myself included, speculate the Flower game to be simulations of existence itself, each flower most likely being a universe in the nothingness of space. What's also interesting is that the rules of the Flower game are the exact same as John Conway's Game of Life, a game where the initial arrangement of the game, or of the flowers anyway, dictates how the patterns form over time. Though what's different from the Game of Life is that the Flower game ends with a specific pattern always winning. That specific pattern being the precursor of the Vex. As you know, they always follow their own pattern, and from that pattern they eventually evolved into the copper robots we encounter now. And so the gardener decides to impose a new rule, which ends up being that both him and the winnower join the game and can influence the patterns. But that raises the question, who are these two mysterious people? I myself am wholly convinced after the reveal of the Witness, the end of the Witch Queen campaign, that he is the winnower in this story. The Witness seems to talk and have the same motivations and views as the winnower in the lore book. It becomes even clearer for me in the remaining entries where he imposes very philosophical questions upon the reader. The winner essentially asks if there can be a form of existence where there's only good, or if there will always need to be a balance between good and evil for things to be in balance. As for the gardener, at first I thought it could be the traveler, but I think the gardener is another entity of sorts. One that we haven't seen yet in the game or anywhere in the lore. It could be inside the traveler, or maybe it's like a completely separate entity that we just haven't seen or met yet. Maybe once we'll get to Lightfall, more will be revealed about the darkness and the light. But for right now, there doesn't really seem to be any kind of character that we know about that fits the gardener in this story. Though it does sort of explain how guardians came to be, since the gardener imposed a new rule that made him and the winner part of the game. The gardener most likely creating the traveler as a way to break the specific pattern, or the vex, from winning the flower game every time. If this is the full reason how the Traveler came to be remains to be known, but for now we can speculate that the Gardener is the reason why the Traveler exists, and subsequently the Guardians after the Traveler came to us. Now, I'll wrap up this video by giving my thoughts on the Flower game and the Unveiling lore book itself. I personally think that the Flower game is honestly a really interesting part of the lore, and the fact that we don't even really know if it's true or not is like some real food for thought. I'm not really much of a person who reads entire lore books, but whilst I was doing research for this video, I found myself almost instantly hooked on reading the entirety of the Unveiling lore book. Even if you're not really too invested into the lore of Destiny, I can highly recommend reading the Unveiling, as it's sort of the starting point of everything. Not exactly, but you get the point. A lot of what is talked about in the lore book is really interesting and makes you kind of look at the entirety of Destiny 2 lore a bit differently. I don't really want to spoil too much of what's mentioned in the other entries of the lore book, but the lore book itself poses a lot of philosophical questions about light and dark, and also about existence itself. Go read it if you're ever inclined. It's not a long lore book, so it won't take too long to go through either. I hope you found this video interesting and maybe even entertaining. This was your host Parker, signing out.